The Cheating Death Podcast is a comedy, random, and truth-seeking podcast containing information, subject language, and course material that may not be suitable for all listeners. Your discretion in this matter is advised. This podcast is me and you, not red versus blue. If you have any questions or feedback, email us at thecheatingdeathpodcast@gmail.com. On today's special episode of the Cheating Death Podcast, we are joined by Justin, creator, host, curator, master craftsman of the Obscura Crime Podcast. He gets into detail and tells us just what makes the magic work. He also provides us with some information as to his past, what has led him to creating such amazing true crime content. So, stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen, because we have a new Annihilation Announcement for you, a new joke of the episode, a top 5, and more. So you know what to do. Grab your coffee, grab your blanket, put your feet up, and let us tell you how you can cheat death. This is your news anchor, the Cleric of Chaos, and this is your Annihilation Announcement. Over the decades and centuries, there have been a litany of crimes which have been committed that have gone unaccounted for. Those in whom have committed them have not been held responsible. But we look towards the future in a Minority Report-esque style thought crime before it happens sort of situation, and we have to understand that there is a certain level to security and privacy, and there is a price to pay for all of it. Remember that just because you are secure does not mean that it is pure. Remember, you shall stay strong, and you will move forward. This has been your news anchor, the Cleric of Chaos, and this is your Annihilation Announcement.
Recording. Willkommen, meine Freunde, guten Morgen, guten Tage und eine gute Nacht ist deine Reisende, deine Ausländer, deine Allesfresser, deine Cleric of Chaos. On today's episode of the Cheating Death Podcast, we have a very special guest, a juggernaut, if you will, in the world of the true crime podcast realm, a man in whom has been running his own exceptionally well-created, crafted, curated, and directed podcast for the better part of the last 10 years. I'd like to introduce Juggernaut Justin from the Obscura Crime Podcast. How are you doing today, Justin?
I'm doing great. Happy to be here.
And happy to have you as well. So I'd like to start off, just by introduce yourself to the audience and let them know exactly how much of a badass you are in the true crime realm.
Yeah, so my name's Justin Drown. I've been doing this for the better part of a decade. When I started creating true crime, there was only a handful of us. So I got in pretty early. I've been lucky in that regard. I don't think I could have broken through in the same way if I started today. And yeah, I just love what I do. And I'm happy to sit down and work on this show week to week. And I feel very lucky to be able to do so.
Well, admittedly, you're rather humble in your approach, especially when you're stating directly that you don't feel that you would have made it if you would have started the podcast like around now. I would hearken to disagree solely because of the fact that because true crime is one of those things, as you're very well aware, is kind of unique to everyone in whom absorbs it, especially when it comes to the different kinds of cases, whether it be the cold case files, the unsolved cases, the murders, like any of the serial killers or the spree killers or anything else to that effect. There are some people who really enjoy people who do the heists and all people who do like all the sorts of big bank robberies and all that. but you have a tendency to focus on a lot of not only some of the most brutal aspects of true crime, but also you spin it in such a way that any person listening to it is able to immediately identify and resonate with how you're speaking. When you were first thinking of starting the podcast, how was it that you came up with the idea to start the Obscura Crime Podcast?
Well, I knew I wanted to create a true crime podcast. I had a couple false starts where I couldn't quite get down what I wanted. Some of my inspirations at the time were, a bit more detailed, and a lot of the true crime podcasts at the time were very about solving the mystery and, things of that nature. For me, I've always been more interested in the background and the details. And so that's what I wanted to focus on when I created the podcast. And the other thing too, is even the podcasts that were a bit more detail oriented, they were focused more so on the bigger hitters. And I think a lot of them are today. And I wanted to lean heavily into more obscure cases.
Hence the Obscura name. So therefore it is not only beautifully named, but it also has a nice ring to it in the sense that you're not going after the Paul Bernardos, you're not going after the John Wayne Gacy's, the Jeffrey Dahmers, the Dean Corals, the Glenn Engelmans. You're more or less going after the ones that most people don't either have the opportunity to cover, don't see, or choose not to cover, or ones that you feel hit that kind of particular niche area. When you make the decision as to what goes into putting together an episode, what is your process when you put an episode together without giving away any of your trade secrets?
Yeah, so lately, when I sit down to research and, find a case, I'm kind of isolated from true crime in general, unless I'm working on it. I'm kind of terrified of sort of plagiarism through osmosis. I don't like to make a show that's similar to other people's. And so when I start digging, a lot of times I'm digging through case files. I am drawn to Florida cases because that's where I live, that's where I'm from. And for me, I'm very lucky in that regard because Florida has sunshine laws. And so I can just dig through file after file until I land on something that catches my eye. And a lot of times that's either A, backstory that greatly interests me, or B, some firsthand audio that can make an episode sort of pop or stand out or connect the audience to the episode. And so that's what I'm looking for, either a great backstory or great audio.
You referred to the sunshine laws, of course, being, in Florida, with respect not only to the access to information that you would have versus other states where you may have to go through separate Freedom of Information Act requests that may vary state by state. Having that open level of transparency obviously makes things a little bit easier and also makes a lot more files available. But when you're looking into a case, let's just say hypothetically you're looking at the Eileen Wuornos case. If there was to be a scenario to where the sunshine law would not be able to assist you in that respect, and it were to be a little bit harder to find, is there any kind of special tactic or any sort of unique kind of research method that you use to find the information?
Yeah, so my method as far as that goes is I don't like to use books. I don't like to use documentaries. I know a lot of other podcasts will do that, but the way that I look at that is that those creators are taking other creators' word for it. And you're basically using secondhand research. And I don't like to do that. If, there aren't a ton of files available, be it, case files or court records or pre-existing interviews with people involved, I'll seek out those people and I'll get interviews done. I used to use interviews a lot in episodes, especially during the first half of the podcast. But due to the sort of narrative I try to create, I don't use a ton of interview audio. But there are cases where it's relied heavily in terms of research on interview audio specifically, so like secondhand accounts, because there aren't a ton of case files, or maybe the files I received were heavily blacked out.
And especially when you're dealing with a heavily redacted file, obviously, once again, dealing with that type of situation when you're looking specifically at a case and then you run into a big thicket of documents and you're like, oh, thank goodness, this is great. I can finally get this taken care of. There's a lot here. And then like a CIA declassified document from 1947, about 85% of it is all blacked out. So you look at it that way and you take that perspective as well as that approach, and you have crafted it into a unique kind of niche category for yourself. Now, you have a ton of content when it comes to the archive of the Obscura True Crime Podcast. You've been doing this for a very long time. You and I initially engaged because you stated that I accurately picked out the time period of where you were working with Jared St. Laurent. You were doing ring work for professional wrestling. During that time of your life, did you find that there was a calling for true crime even as far back as your days working in professional wrestling? Or did it finally kind of just click in the 2010s where you're just like, hey, I'm really good at this. Maybe I should do this now?
It is such a trip that you know who Mr. Saint Laurent is. That really caught me off guard because it's something I think about occasionally, and it's such a niche part of my life. But yeah, so when I was a teenager, I had an interest in being involved in professional wrestling, and I got involved with the ring crew for SCW, a wrestling company in the area, and I actually got a hernia doing that stuff. That it took like 3 surgeries to take care of. But also they would allow me to train as well sometimes, which was pretty nice. But I did get to know a lot of the wrestlers that were around at that time. And Mr. St. Laurent became borderline a father figure in some ways at the time. Like, he gave me a lot of great advice. And one of the things that he told me that was kind of a harsh truth is, you know, he drew attention to the fact, like, look, you're not a tall guy. You know, you're 5'9", and you don't have a background in, you know, amateur wrestling. You know, you're not involved in any level sport. If you're serious about getting into professional wrestling, you should really pursue, you know, have one of those pursuits to where, you know, you can be better than all of the big guys athletically to sort of, you know, justify your size. He said, or B, the other route you can take is you can pursue other aspects of professional wrestling. And so one of the things I was always interested at the time was writing. And I got in my head, like, you know, maybe I could be like a professional wrestling writer. And I started, you know, getting involved in writing more and more, and I would write a lot of stuff. And I was even published a few times, short stories, poems, stuff like that I think is just sort of lost to time now. And I always had an interest in continuing to write. Life sort of happened, but it was always sort of in the back of my head. And that sort of, you know, when MSL kind of gave me that advice, that was sort of like the spark that eventually led to the podcast happening, if that makes sense.
No, it absolutely does make sense, especially the way you articulated it and described it. It provides a pretty clear, steady path into how you got to where you are now. But to touch base on what MSL told you, to be direct, I feel it's been 20 years, probably, about 19, 20 years since him and Scott Hall were communicating with people and like genuinely trying to help people with getting into pro wrestling, people who very much so were in your position, people who were in my position in completely different time zones, completely different areas of the world. As a 16, 17-year-old kid, wrestling has been kind of a big thing my entire life. I'm like an actor, a stage performer, a stand-up comedian, all that. So the theatric aspect of it, the performance aspect of professional wrestling has always appealed to me ever since I could first remember my very first memory of pro wrestling, which was The Undertaker, Madison Square Garden. I believe it was in 1991, in March. That would be around that time. I was about 2.5. But the one thing that makes me happy about the connection that you and I have to Mr. Saint Laurent is he's one of the dudes in wrestling who has been quietly going about his business the entire time that he has been in the professional wrestling business. He has not once ever gone on any form of social media and said, I am better than Vince McMahon. I am better than Ted Turner. I am better than Dixie Carter. I am better than this and that, this and that, this and that. And how he helped Court Bauer during the initial stages of the beginning of MLW, and how it parlayed into you communicating with him. And probably around the same time, I was emailing him back and forth. I was emailing WWA 4 in Atlanta. Brad Reingen's old school I was trying to get in touch with to see if he was still training people. At the time, there weren't as many facilities in Canada or in Germany outside of Alex Wright's school. And Alex Wright's school was just a little bit too far away geographically. So communicating with MSL, he was literally one of the only people who not only took the time to communicate absolutely everything via email, but he asked me about who I was, what kind of person I am, like obviously height, weight, athletic background, this and that, this and that. But he never stopped showing genuine interest. And I feel that the professional wrestling business now, especially with how him and Court have been doing really well with MLW lately, there needs to be a lot more people like him. When it comes to influences that you've had with respect to true crime and starting your podcast and how you began, who would you say that your influences are that really got you to push the button and get it started?
Yeah, as far as true crime goes, I sort of, I credit my background. I think a lot of true crime creators tend to have a rough upbringing, at least in my experience, the people I speak to. It's something we have in common. And a lot of true crime fans as well, people that are kind of drawn to darker content. So, yeah, I would credit my upbringing as, first and foremost. But then Unsolved Mysteries, I was huge on growing up. Rescue 911 is one that a lot of people don't talk about anymore. Another one is Dr. Bodden. He had a show on HBO that was the most brutal out there, like by far. It was Autopsy with Dr. Bodden. And, that was one that was very intense for its time. They played it on HBO. And so they used that as a hook to sort of show more. And I remember it being like the first true crime show where you would see like the bodies, for example. Like that was not very common. I mean, genuinely, like you would see every detail, but it was still done like respectfully. It was done like tastefully. It strangely didn't feel exploitative. And I think that was a big influence. Another one is there's this guy, I won't really stand up for him morally, but there was a guy named Peter Sotos, or he's still around. And I consider him sort of the godfather of true crime. He made a very extreme true crime in the 80s and 90s. And his work is very intense to the point that he ended up getting arrested for child abuse material for the stuff that he was collecting to create true crime on. And so, yeah, I can't really stand for him morally, but I would also be lying if I wouldn't say some of the way that he presented crime kind of leaked into my work a little bit too, in terms of influence. And then different true crime books as well, throughout the years were a big influence. I know she's like maybe less cool to mention, but Anne Rule, a lot of her books that I read, she did a really good job as presenting true crime as almost like as a novel, right? Like she would create a narrative in your mind, but not stray away from the facts. So maybe use the weather that was around at the time of a case or whatever to sort of add to the case. And she's got to be one of the earliest to do that. I think she was a pretty big influence in the genre. And so, yeah, In terms of influences, I would say those are what influenced me the most.
And to be blunt with you, you also like as far as my personal listening experiences when it comes to like different varying episodes of what you cover, you always in each and every single episode have a journalistic approach with a significant level of integrity. As somebody who like has a very very high level of amount of respect for like Christiane M. Poor, Walter Cronkite, Walter Matthau the actor, Jack Lemmon the actor, and like a whole lot of you know rich old school kind of like truth seeking but without being vicious to people sort of journalism, like in a way kind of like Chris Hansen when he started on Dateline NBC before the To Catch a Predator stuff in the 90s, when he was working more fully as a reporter dealing with all aspects of like Dateline elements and reporting with NBC instead of then inevitably going on to focus on true crime. And he decided to go catch predators because of the I believe it was the Molly McCann case. The He was covering it back in the 80s, the late 80s, I believe. He said he was in Detroit, and he said that it impacted him in such a way that he knew that he had to catch trial predators for the rest of his life because it's just something that spoke to him on such a level, and it just resonated with him so deeply that he doesn't want to see anybody else go through that. Now, obviously, nowadays he has his own streaming network. He's obviously monetizing a whole lot of it. But, Chris Hansen is almost 70 years old. I don't think he's going to be retiring anytime soon. So the more money the guy can have, I mean, good for him. But when we look at our approaches and our own views as to how not only true crime is perpetuated and like the content is created, you and I are firmly well aware that you could throw a dime in a Roosevelt bucket and find yourself a dozen podcasts that will literally cover, for example, John Wayne Gacy in the course of a week. Then you will have your segment of podcasts that will cover somebody no one has ever heard of. So like somebody like a Richard Kuklinski, like the Iceman, or the Rostov Ripper, or in greater effects like that. But when you take into account exactly how you have crafted your show, I want to say very directly that, one, I appreciate your approach to research. It is quite clear how you craft and how you curate your episodes, that you are crisp, that you are clear, and it almost seems like a perfect hybrid of being rehearsed 1,000 times, but also going off the cuff. So whenever you get into detail about something, you also get this really excited kind of tone in your voice, as if to say, yeah, now we're really getting into it. Now we're really getting it. And you engage the listener to not only listen, but to actively listen to your content. And when it comes to some of the difficulties that you may have faced in curating or crafting some of your episodes, what would be some examples of them?
Yeah, so I do try to maintain like a journalistic standpoint when creating true crime, and it has its pros and cons. So in terms of pros, I'm very aware of the fact that people view true crime as an exploitative genre. And so the pro that I would say is that for me, the way to be least exploitative is to make it as much as possible not about myself. I have a separate thing for that. I call them the fireside chats, and that's where people can kind of get to know me. But it always drove me a little crazy when I would listen to true crime podcasts, and half of them would be about what that podcaster had been up to throughout the week, right? And so for me, it's hyper detail focused, and I also try to avoid fluff as well. I'm not going to tell you what every piece of grass looked like or what the sports teams were doing. All those things that a lot of writers out there will use to sort of extend the runtime, and that's where I can get into the cons of it. So because of that, sometimes the runtime of my podcast can suffer because I'm digging up obscure cases that may be off the beaten track and never covered before. The runtime can be anything from 20 minutes to 90 minutes or 45 minutes. There's not like a set runtime. It really is just, hey, I find a case, I'm interested in it. Let's see what I can dig up. And well, it gets to a point where I've done as much research as I possibly can. I've exhausted what I have. It's time to work on the episode. And the sort of difficulty that you can run into is you're like, damn, this episode was only 23 minutes. That can be like a huge pain. But, what I'll never do is I'll never sort of find ways to pad it out. I can't stand padding. So I would rather release a 23-minute episode that is hyper-focused on the detail than something that, I tried to drag out to 30 minutes just to get it there. And the way that I sort of kind of cope with that is that I never take breaks. There are a lot of podcasts that they'll take 2 to 3 months off a year, or maybe they only release 3 episodes a month. On my Patreon and on the main feed, when everything's combined, I drop about 6 to 8 episodes worth of content a month. And so, maybe one episode might be 23 minutes, but when the next one's 45 minutes or an hour, it makes up for it, And so, yeah, I guess that's sort of the difficulty I can run into, is that I am limited by the facts available, considering I try to stick with obscure stuff.
Well, and especially when you take into consideration exactly how you approach each topic individually, and you basically, and correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as like my listening experience goes, and a couple of the people who I've talked to about your podcast, their listening experience goes, we feel that you uniquely craft and create each episode as if it's the first time and the 1,000th time that you've done it, which also brings not only a level of familiarity, but also an obvious attention to detail. You care greatly about the type of content that you put out. And I have to second your notion about the fluff, about not putting anything in to pad the length of an episode or anything else to that effect. Like for most of the Cheating Death episodes, we run anywhere between 10 to 20 minutes. When we do an interview, it's obviously going to be a bit longer. But the whole point is to give you the content that you need in a digestible format, especially given that us as podcast hosts, podcast curators, so on and so forth, we understand that there's probably already like a handful and or maybe a dozen or 2 podcasts that other people are listening to. So I feel that you also take that into account. You take your episode time and you care a lot about it specifically to ensure that your listeners are being able to not only listen to your podcast and give it the attention it needs, but if in the event that they want to go listen to a football podcast or they want to go listen to a podcast about the new Wicked musical or something, then they still have that opportunity. Now, when it comes to exactly how you look at obscure cases versus the regular cases, or like the more highly renowned cases of serial killers, rapists, and XYZ, fill in the name of the crime. Is there any one particular case that has stuck out as just resonating with you as being like, oh my God, I never thought a human being could be like this ever?
Yeah, I mean, there's 2 specifically that have directly affected me. There's the Caitlin Nicole Davis case. That was a Black Label. That one was, I watched like hundreds of hours of live streams of this 12-year-old girl. She would sit on live streams and she would have all these men harassing her. And then her home life was very bad. She had a mother that was, she doesn't deserve the name mother. I'll just put it that way. And a stepfather that was sexually abusing her. And she would try to escape to online in, early 2000s internet land. And it would just be full of adult men asking a 12-year-old to do sexually explicit acts. And so it's like she couldn't really escape. And then on top of that, she had to raise her siblings. And she slept on a wet mattress in the basement. And the sort of where the episode goes is she hangs herself on live stream while a bunch of chatters were in the chat asking her to, expose herself before she did it. And that, I mean, I had to hire writers for a while because I couldn't deal with the research there for like a year. I took a year off from the writing because I never thought like a case could get to me, but I really felt like I had gotten to know her through all our live streams. I just found myself getting like increasingly angry. And that, I think that's the only episode I've ever recorded where when I'm, I try to avoid monologues or whatever, but I just couldn't help myself. And so, there's a borderline wrestling promo at the end of the episode on the people that didn't help her. I don't know if I've ever said it in a fireside chat or anything, but I was literally crying as I was saying it because I was just so mad. And there's I guess the other one that affected me. It's kind of 2 parts, maybe 3, I can't remember, but I've done several episodes on the porn industry. And the rough aspect of that is that the women that I've interviewed, a good portion of them have killed themselves over the years. So the women that, were kind of exploited in that industry, several of them are now gone. And I just find that extremely haunting and tragic. And the one that particularly haunts me is I was supposed to follow up with one, and I got involved with the birth of my daughter. And by the time I went to reach back out to her, she had killed herself. And so, yeah, I would say it's a combination between those two.
That is, admittedly, that is I wasn't expecting to be hit that hard. When we look at cases like that, and especially you having written and researched and watched and helplessly watched, for lack of a better term, and those feelings rising up in you. I mean, like, at the end of the day, there's only so much one person can take before they're inevitably going to snap. And in that kind of scenario, especially if you're covering something that brutal, that ruthless, and that needlessly cold, if you're not a human being, that's not going to impact you as much as it did you, and as much as I feel it would impact, moderately decent people, some people who have, some way of a right way leaning compass. But leaning into those 2 particular cases, when we look at, and we're going to get into the top 5 portion of the program now, essentially, given the nature of the type of true crime that you cover, I understand that your list may be different, but the top 5 serial killers / like spree killers that I have compiled in a rapid fire fashion are: number 5, Dean Corll; number 4, John Wayne Gacy; number 3, Glenn Engelman; number 2, Pedro Lopez; and number 1 would more than likely be a tie between the Rostov Ripper or Paul Bernardo.
Yeah. Did you want me to do mine or no?
Yes, please.
Okay. So I'll admit, I struggled a little bit on this because, believe it or not, outside of the podcast, these days, because I've been doing this for a decade, or close to a decade, I don't do true crime as like a hobby, and so for me, when I work, a lot of the stuff I research, that becomes my interest as far as true crime goes, because when I'm working on it, I become obsessed with it. So what I have here is I have a top 5 list, but only one of them is a serial killer. The other 4 are just killers, because I tend not to cover serial killers too often. There have been a few throughout the years, but when you're covering kind of more obscure stuff, a lot of the times it's often just straight up killers. So for my top 5, number 5, this has been sort of this is the serial killer on the list. This has been sort of a lifelong obsession for me, is Aileen Wuornos. The reason for that is that she is one of maybe 2, serial killers that I feel a genuine sense of empathy and sympathy for. I find her backstory incredibly tragic, and while it doesn't dismiss what she did, you can understand how she got to that point. So for me, Aileen Wuornos is someone that's always kind of, stuck with me as far as that goes. Then, into the killers. Tina Brown is one that I did recently. She, again, this is a person that had an incredibly brutal background. I broke it up into 2 episodes, and the first one was entirely covering just her backstory. And when people heard that episode, they're like, we're supposed to dislike this person? Like, are you kidding me? Like, all the things that she went through. And by the time, you get to the second episode, she does something so incredibly heinous and awful that you're like, okay, no, I actually do hate this person. And so it's kind of like an interesting dichotomy. Then there's Trey Eric Sessler, Mr. Anime. I think he was the 19th case I covered. And what makes this interesting for me is that I was a fan of his work before he murdered his family. So he had a YouTube channel, and he was called Mr. Anime, and he would review anime. And as a young man, I was into anime, and he was one of like 2 anime YouTubers in the early days of YouTube. And so I would watch his work. And what makes his story interesting is that there's an ounce of redemption in his story, because the plan was he wanted to shoot up a school and get as high as a body count as possible. And after he killed his family, he immediately had, huge regret. He turned himself in, and he told the investigators that, I deserve to be in prison. And so, while it doesn't wash away, what he did, I do kind of appreciate that, like, sort of redemption story. Now, one that I haven't covered just because the information's a little bit limited, but the story fascinates me. There's this woman named Jade Jenks. What makes it interesting is that the backstory of how she arrived to killing someone. She was raised by her, mom and stepfather, and she looked up greatly to her stepfather, to the point that in her 20s, she lived with her stepfather. And, he ended up having a health event and going to the hospital, and she happened to go on his computer, and she found thousands of nudes of herself that he had on his computer. And she was so enraged that when he came home, she killed him. And she was giving like 25 years in prison. There's a contingent of people saying that, this guy had it coming. So it's a pretty complex case. And then my number 1 is Tony Peralta. This was very interesting for me because he killed someone and got away with it. There's pretty amazing body cam footage. But he was so overcome with grief and just pain over having done this to someone that cared about him that 15 years later, he just went and turned himself in. And it was like a massive weight had been lifted off his shoulder. And that one in particular really kind of, resonates with me, because he is the first one that I can think of that genuinely seems sincere in his regret. Like, I can genuinely feel it coming off of him. And, he got away with it. There was no reason for him to turn himself in other than, to get this shame, off his back, essentially. So, yeah, that would be my top 5.
No, that's an outstanding list, especially when you take into consideration not only the diversification of the types of people that you put on that list, but also the reasonings behind them, especially the Eileen Wuornos case. I think we're both familiar with the Charlize Theron movie in 2005 called Monster, which focused a lot on her life. It was obviously a theatrical, highly, choreographed, basically version. Charlize Theron and Christina Ricci in that movie. But when you take into consideration exactly how you put it, the scenario that she was thrust into from such a young age, the criticality of the day by day, the month by month, the year by year for her as a child. She never had a break. She was never able to catch a break under any circumstance. And it just seemed like every path that she would go down, no matter how hard she would try, there would be bits and pieces of when she would try to be a decent human being. And then when that failed, she would just go back to doing what she did best. Well, I don't want to say doing what she did best. That makes it sound like I condone it, and I absolutely do not. But I absolutely love how you detailed very thoroughly not only the reasonings, but also your approach into it and your mindset into it. So, with that being said, that is the top 5, and would like to thank Justin for coming on the program very much so today. It has been an absolutely outstanding opportunity to speak with you. And before we end the program, Justin, I'd like to ask you, where can everybody find you, and what can we do to support you?
Yeah, you can find me wherever you get your podcasts. YouTube, I barely upload anything to that due to the rules of YouTube. My podcast tends to break it. But Spotify, iTunes, Overcast, any of those apps, you'll be able to find my podcast, just not YouTube. And you can support me by listening to the podcast.
Excellent. Well, once again, Justin, I would like to take the opportunity to thank you very much so for taking the time to speak with us here at the Cheating Death Podcast today. And remember, ladies and gentlemen, to follow him on over at Twitter at the Obscura Crime Podcast. My apologies. And always make sure to tip your servers and your customer service people. And with that being said, thank you for tuning in today. Take care of yourself and each other.
At the top of today's episode, we promised you a top 5 list. And while we've already given you a top 5 list of our most notorious serial killers, we'd also like to provide you with a top 5 list of the most common weapons used in murders. Coming in at number 5, we have the baseball bat. Coming in at number 4, we have the knife. Coming in at number 3, we have the rope, the ligature, or the strangulation technique. Coming in at number 2, we have the poison. And coming in at number 1, we have the almighty gun. What is your top 5 and or your most noticed 5? Give us an email at thecheatingdeathpodcast@gmail.com. Today's joke is brought to you by the Cleric of Chaos. If you are looking to be driving on a highway and you find yourself picking up a one-legged hitchhiker, how do you ask him to step into your car? Simple. You tell him to hop in. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Justin from the Obscura Crime Podcast for visiting the Cheating Death Podcast today and showing us some of the detail behind what it takes to make his beautiful, tremendous true crime content. Please give him a follow on his Twitter page as well as his YouTube, and on all podcasting platforms, download every episode you can. And to all the dear listeners out there, thank you so much for 97 episodes. We are very happy and we are very content, and we are glad that you look forward to each episode as much as we look forward to creating it for you. Thank you for tuning in today. Take care of yourselves and each other. The Cheating Death Podcast has been brought to you by Nach dem Leben, CRDVC, Chaos Run Records, and CR Deutschland. We are available on all major podcasting platforms. If you'd like to follow the podcast, you may do so at twitter.com/weallcheatdeath and twitter.com/Cleric of Chaos. And if you have any questions or comments, email us at thecheatingdeathpodcast@gmail.com. If you'd like to support the program with a one-time gift, a monthly supporters club, or by booking a music lesson or a meeting, you may do so at the links in the episode's description at linktr.ee/Cleric of Chaos. If you'd like to book a $10 cameo, the link is there as well. And please support our friends, producers, and consultants of the program at the links in the episode's description as well. If you or anyone you know is experiencing psychiatric duress, please call 1-800-273-8255 or dial 988 from your mobile phone in the US or Canada. If anyone you know is experiencing domestic violence, call 1-800-799-7233. And if you're looking at adopting a playful puppy or cute kitten, please visit your local animal adoption rescue center. Remember, holidays are around the corner. Don't be hard on yourself. Take care. And remember, we're pulling for you. We're all in this together.